Hey guys, it's Mrs. Klein again.
I'm Mrs. Wolbrin. Welcome to your second podcast. We're going to get started with talking about the colonies before 1763. For more than a century, the British government had, for the most part, left the colonies alone to solve their own problems. During this time, Americans in each colony had learned to govern themselves by electing their own assemblies.
Then we come up to some conflict in the Ohio Valley. Okay, as the colonies grew, settlers began to dream of moving across the Appalachian Mountains and into the Ohio Valley, the region between the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. If you look at the map, you guys, in the book, you'll be able to get a clear picture of where this area is. Both Great Britain and France claimed this area. In 1754, the French honored their claim by building Fort Duquesne, where the city of Pittsburgh stands today.
News of the fort alarmed the governor of Virginia. He ordered a small force of Virginia militia, or a small army of citizens trained to fight in an emergency, to drive the French out of the Ohio Valley.
All right, this leads to something that's called the French and Indian War. This war was part of a long struggle between France and Great Britain over territory and power. Because many American Indians fought with France in this latest conflict, the colonists called it the French and Indian War.
In 1763, Great Britain and France signed a peace treaty or agreement, finally ending the French and Indian War, which had another name. It was also called the 7-Year War. In this treaty, France ceded or gave its claim of land in Canada to Great Britain.
Okay. And you guys know that the English and the French have fought with one another and hated one another for centuries. It doesn't change when they're trying to get land in the New World either. Okay, all right. And the British are victorious, and the colonies have to pay for that.
Yes.
Okay, all right. This next section is called Early British Actions in the Colonies. So in 1760, a new king named George III had begun his reign toward the end of the French and Indian War.
And he initiated the Proclamation of 1763. The British government faced a number of problems after the French and Indian War. One was how to keep colonists and American Indians from killing each other as settlers pushed westward.
Yeah, because Native Americans aren't going to be happy with these new folks moving into their territory, generally speaking, right? Okay, all right. And so there became some conflicts and issues, and the British also realized we got to pay for this war. This was pretty expensive, and so this is now where a bunch of the acts and proclamations come in, where they're going to try to get some money from the colonists.
Yes.
The first of which, you guys, is called the Stamp Act. So in 1765, the prime minister, his name was George Grenville, proposed a new act or a law that was called the Stamp Act, which required colonists to buy a stamp for every piece of paper they used. Okay, all right, because the colonists had no representatives in Parliament, they saw the Stamp Act as a violation of their rights as British subjects.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember they do think of themselves as British subjects. They are British
Absolutely.
In their minds.
And Mrs. Wolbrin, talk a little bit about the Stamp Act, though, because it's not like a stamp, like a postage stamp, right? What is it?
Right. So they had to pay a tax on all paper. Newspapers, wills, licenses, and even playing cards had to be printed on stamped paper. Therefore, the British government getting that tax.
Okay, all right. And the colonists didn't have any say in it. So there wasn't like they could go to another store and buy different paper.
Right.
They had to buy this paper that had been stamped by the English government. All right. So eventually, you guys, after months of protest, Parliament repealed or canceled the Stamp Act. All right.
Okay. And that takes us to the next act, the Quartering Act.
Yep.
The Quartering Act was a law that ordered colonial assemblies to provide British troops with quarters or housing. So basically, if you are a colonist and British troops are in your area and they want to live in your home, they can. You are obligated under law to house them and provide them with food.
Yep. Food, like they eat your food, they drink your beer. And eventually these guys, this really starts to cause conflict because the British soldiers didn't get paid very much at all, right? That's why it is that American colonists had to give them a place to stay and food to eat and a roof over their head. And then they start taking jobs away from from colonial workers. Okay, all right, because they're willing to work for less, and that continues to cause conflict. But you guys, these are armed soldiers that you don't have a say-so in it. They got to come and stay in your house. If they knock at your door, you got to give them a place to stay.
Yeah, and they're not respectful of you or your family. They're taking your beds.
Yep.
And we're moving on.
Okay,
the Townshend Acts. The next British leader to face the challenge of taxing the colonies was Charles Townshend. Townsend kept his promise, and in 1767 he persuaded Parliament to pass the Townsend Acts. The new laws placed a duty or tax on certain goods the colonies imported from Great Britain, including such popular items as glass, paint, paper, and tea.
All right. Then colonists aren't too happy about things right now. So they start to boycott British goods. A Boston patriot named Samuel Adams led the opposition to the Townsend Acts. Eventually, soon, colonies decide to boycott British goods in order to protect their rights. This was a peaceful form of protest that even loyalists could support.
Yeah. So next we're going to talk about the repeal of the Townsend Acts. So meanwhile, a new leader named Lord North became head of the British government. And early in 1770, North persuaded Parliament to repeal all the Townsend duties, except for one, the tax on tea.
Oh, the dreaded tea.
And the British love their tea.
Yes, they do. And again, like Mrs. Wilburn said, you guys, people living here in the colonies considered themselves, they were British citizens. So they, along with everybody who lived in England, want to sip their tea.
Exactly.
Okay, all right.
And that takes us to the Boston Massacre.
On the same day that Parliament repealed most of the Townsend duties, a fight broke out between soldiers and colonists in Boston. Patriots called this incident the Boston Massacre. Okay, all right. What really happened was actually a small riot.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Now we have mob violence breaking out. On March 5th, 1770, a noisy mob began throwing rocks and ice balls at troops guarding the Boston Customs House. As the mob pressed forward, the troops, in a panic, opened fire.
Was it a massacre or self-defense? Samuel Adams saw this event as a perfect opportunity to whip up anti-British feeling. One hero, a Boston lawyer named John Adams, came out of this sad event. Although John Adams was a patriot like his cousin Samuel, he also believed that every person, even the British soldiers, had the right to a fair trial. And at the murder trial, Adams argued that the troops had acted in self-defense. Okay. And he actually wins their freedom, right?
He does.
He believes in the rule of law, takes precedence over anything else.
And John Adams goes on to become our second president.
Yes, he does, definitely.
Okay, next we have the Boston Tea Party, which I know you all remember since back, fifth grade?
Fifth grade,
they learned
absolutely.
About this before?
Yep.
Okay. However, things did not stay peaceful because in 1773, a new law called the Tea Act prompted more protests. The Tea Act was Lord North's attempt to rescue the British East India Company. The Tea Act,
You're good.
lowered the cost of tea that was sold by the British East India Company in the colonies. As a result, even taxed British tea became cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea.
But colonists weren't fooled. They saw the Tea Act as still another attempt to tax them without their consent. In addition, many merchants were alarmed by the East India Company's monopoly over the tea trade. They had an opportunity to buy it from somewhere else, but England says, "Nuh-uh, the only tea you're going to buy is coming from us." And guess what? It has a tax on it.
Yep. On December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty decided to unload the tea, but not in the way the governor had in mind. That night, about 60 men dressed as Mohawk Indians boarded the 3 ships. The Sons of Liberty dumped about 90,000 pounds of tea into the sea that night. News of the Boston Tea Party excited patriots throughout the colonies.